All right, guys, I think it's time that we have a frank discussion about your nuts. I'm talking about these guitar nuts because the guitar nut plays a critical role in determining the layout of your guitar, and it's something that you need to consider carefully before you start to cut, carve, and sand any wood. Because if you forget to pay some attention to your nut, you're going to have some issues later on down the road. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Now, when it comes to designing a guitar, and it doesn't matter whether you're creating a new design, something that you've been dreaming of in your head, or whether you're going to be copying an existing shape, like a replica guitar, you have to consider the nut, and you have to make some decisions about its dimension before you can start to commit to cutting up any wood, because the nut is going to determine things such as the width and taper of your guitar neck, and it's going to play a critical role in laying out the shape of your headstock, that sort of thing. So it's almost like you can consider the nut to be where it all starts. So what I'm going to do is jump on the computer and bring you along, and hopefully I can explain what some of these critically important nut dimensions are. So let's get started. I learned a long time ago that when it comes to laying out a guitar, it all starts with the nut and some decisions that have to be made about some of the dimensions for the nut. And this is true no matter how you're going to build the guitar or what kind of guitar you're going to make. You know, if you're making a custom design, that's something you've got sort of spinning around in your head, you can start out by sketching out some basic rough shapes for the body and the headstock and that sort of thing. But when it actually comes to making a layout for either the templates that you're going to use or the G-code, if you're using CNC, you've got to start making some decisions right off the bat about the dimensions of the nut. And what I typically will do is I'll decide, first of all, how wide I want to make my nut. Now, I'm here in Adobe Illustrator, so I'm going to try to draw this out, and hopefully this will explain things to you in a fairly simple way. Now, I'll forewarn you, this does involve a fair amount of math. However, later on in the video, I'm going to show you a simple trick that I think you'll find really useful for making some of these decisions. But let's say I want to make a nut that's 1 5/8 inches wide, or 1.625 in decimals. I'll draw that up here, and let's say I want the nut to be 1.1875 inches thick. That would be roughly 3/16 of an inch thick. So I draw it, and this is what the nut would look like if I'm looking from the top down at the guitar. And what I'll do is I'll label this up here as bass, and then down here we'll label this as treble. And this will be the bass side of the nut, and then this would be the treble side. So the next thing we have to decide is how far in from each edge we want the strings. Now, there's no set specific measurement that you need to follow. This is something that you can decide on your own. Typically, what I see is a dimension of 0.09375 inches. However, I like to go with 0.125 inches. That's just always what I've done. There's really no right way or wrong way here. So what I'll do is I'll draw an imaginary string here. And this is going to be our the bass, the string on the bass side. And then I'll duplicate that down, and this becomes the string for the treble side. Now, obviously, as you can see, I have it sitting right on the edge, and that's not going to work. We need to have the string inside that edge so that the strings don't fall off the fretboard when you try to press them down to the frets, or especially when you're doing some string bending. So like I said, I like to do 0.125, so I'm just going to move that string down 1/8 of an inch on that side, and I'm going to move this one up 1/8 of an inch. So that right there is where my strings would rest over in the nut slots, so that I would have about 1/8 of an inch space. Now, if I select both of these, I can see that the distance between the two is 1.375 inches. That's my string spread. However, here's where things get a little bit complicated. It all depends on the gauge of the strings you're using, because what we're measuring here is the distance between the exact center of the string and the edge of the nut, which would also be the edge of the fretboard. However, if our string is a 0.046 inch diameter string, then that means the actual edge of the string is going to be closer to the edge of the fretboard than the 0.125 inches I specified earlier. So what we have to do is we have to compensate. If we want exactly 0.125 inches from the edge of the nut, what we have to do is we have to shift the center of this line down to compensate. If the string is 0.046 inches in diameter, that means we have to move this down equal to the radius of the string, which is half the diameter. So if the diameter is 0.046 inches, then the radius is 0.023 inches. So what we have to do is do a quick calculation. We have to take 0.125, which is our space between the edge of the nut and the string, and add to that the radius of the string that we're going to use, 0.023 inches. And that gives us a dimension of 0.148 inches. So that's where the center of the slot is going to be from the edge. So what I'll do is I'm just going to move this down an additional 0.023 inches, which is the radius of that string. It barely moves, but now we know for sure that the edge of the string is going to be exactly 0.125 inches from the edge of the nut. Now for the treble string, if we're using a 0.01 inch diameter string, which is a 10 gauge string, then that means we have to take 0.125 inches and add to it 0.005, which is the radius of a 10 gauge string. And that means we have to position the center of that slot 0.13 inches from the edge of the nut. So all I'm going to do in this case here is I'm just going to move it up 0.005 inches. Barely moves. But now when we select the two strings, we can see our string spread is now 0.1347 inches. But what we can be assured of is that the distance from the edge of the nut to the edge of the string is going to be exactly 0.125 inches. Okay, so why is it so important to make these dimensional decisions about the nut before doing anything else? It's because these decisions, combined with a couple of others I'll explain in a minute, will play a pivotal role in determining the width and taper of both the neck and the fretboard. And you have to make those decisions before you do anything else. Otherwise, you're playing with fire. So let me demonstrate a little bit more here. So we've got our strings in the position that they need to be in to make the guitar. But what we haven't done is we haven't determined the taper yet of the strings from the bridge to the nut. So what I'll do is I'm going to draw a line that will represent the string. And this is going to be, the length of this line is going to be 25.5 inches, which is my scale length from the front of the nut. So I'll draw that, and then I'm going to duplicate that down into position for the treble string. Now if I back out so that we can see the whole thing, this is what that's going to look like. What we can do now is we can determine at the end of the scale length where the bridge is, what the string spread is going to be for the bridge that we're going to use. Now it's really important to either find out what the string spread is for the bridge that you're going to use, and you can often find that from the manufacturer, or you can purchase the bridge and then measure the distance between the high E and the low E saddles from the very center of the notch that the strings are going to sit in at the front of the bridge. So once you have that dimension, you can then position it here at the end of the scale length. So let's say, just for the sake of discussion, that our string spread is going to be we'll do 2.0625. And then up here, I'm just going to make this 1/4 of an inch. This is of no consequence. It's just for the rectangle. And the reason I'm drawing the rectangle is because now I have a center which I can position relative to the center of the nut. So I'll put a guideline here. And then I'm going to zoom in. And I'll position that right on there. So now we know that our string spread is centered with the nut. And then I'll bring it forward until it's right there at the edge of the scale length. And then I'm going to select the end here. I'm going to move that up until it contacts the end. And I'll move this one down till it contacts the end of the string spread there. So now what we have is we have the taper of our strings. See, this was the original strings when they were straight on, but this is the taper, or the strings with the taper. So what I can do now is I can copy this, and then I'm going to bring it down until it comes right into contact with the edge of the nut on the base side. And then I'm going to drag this one down, a copy of it, and then move that into position right at the end of the treble side at the face of the nut. So what we have now is the width and the taper of the fretboard and the neck. And so I can use that as my basis for laying out the shape of my neck, including the heel. I can add in the headstock and do all that. Now, another interesting consideration here is the actual distance between each string. And there are mathematical formulas that you can use to calculate this. However, if you don't want to do all the math, and who wants to do all that math? I mean, I'd rather be cutting, carving, and sanding than sitting here typing numbers into a calculator. What I can do instead is type numbers into a website. This is Manchester Guitar Tech, and it has this really handy calculator for calculating the nut. And I'm going to put a link to this page down in the description below of this video so that you can check this out, because there are several calculators that I found on the internet, but this one is the most accurate, and it actually takes into consideration precisely the gauge of the strings that you're going to be using. Now, all the dimensions here have to be in millimeters, so you have to kind of convert that over if you're using imperial dimensions. For all of you who are outside of the United States, this will be a piece of cake. So with this calculator, what I can do, and I've already got the imperial converted over to millimeters, so I would, for a 1.625 inch wide nut, it's going to be 41.275 millimeters, so I'll just put that in there. Then on the base side, the end gaps, that's the distance between the edge of the nut and what will be the edge of the string. So on the base side, I want 3.175 millimeters, which is 0.125 inches. Same thing on the treble side. Now you can make this whatever you want. You can change that. You don't have to go with what I'm specifying here. This is mainly for an example, and it's typically what I use. You can also add in the string spacing. So a lot of guys will know exactly how wide they want the nut, and they also know exactly what kind of string spacing that they want. So you could actually, instead of putting in the end gaps, you could just put in the string spacing along with the nut width. But I'm going to use the distance here. Then down here, we can type in our string gauge sizes. Now, string gauge sizes are typically in imperial, and our E is going to be 46, the A is going to be 36, the D string will be 26, G is 17, B is 13, and the E is 10. Those are the gauges. And those are also, you add a 0.0 in front of that and you've got the inches dimension. So what we can do now is we can hit calculate. And what this is going to do is it's going to present us with dimensions here, either on the bass side or the treble side. This is the distance from those edges of where the center of the string will be positioned for each one. That's where you would place your nut file when you go to file the slot. So you can measure it either from the bass side or from the treble side. And what I've discovered in checking these numbers is it takes into account the gauge of your strings. So if you place your nut file at exactly 3.76 millimeters from the edge of the bass side of the nut, once you've cut that slot and put the string in there, the edge of that string is going to be exactly 3.175 millimeters from the edge of the nut. So that gives me exactly the dimension that I want. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can use these numbers to figure out where we're going to put the slots in the nut for each of the strings. So the first thing I have to do is put a mark at 3.76 millimeters from this base edge. So I'll select that edge and we're going to do 3.76 millimeters here. So that's where our first slot is going to be. Now the second slot will be 11.03 millimeters. So we'll type 11.3. Okay, so now we have the E string and the A string. So next I'm going to position the D string, and that's at 18.05 millimeters. So I'll place that one. And next we're going to do the G string, which is going to be at 24.83 millimeters. So I'll type that in and place it. So now we have the E string, the A, the D, and the G. And now I can do the B string, which is at 31.45 millimeters. So I'll select that and I'll type in 31.45 and I'll position that one. And then the final string is going to be the high E string, which is at 37.97 millimeters from the edge of the bass side. And so now I have all those strings placed. Now the next thing you can do is figure out exactly where the strings are going to contact each saddle. So the way I'm going to do this is pretty much similar to what I did with the nut. I'm just going to move this edge. I'm going to copy it and move it down into position where those strings are going to fall. And unfortunately, we can't take into account the string gauge when it comes to determining the position of the strings at the saddle, because most guitar bridge saddles are equidistant between each saddle. They don't take into account the gauge of the strings that you're going to use. The only way you can do that is if you use like a vintage style Telecaster bridge that has the saddles are those threaded rods, and you can move the string from one thread to another to try to, as closely as possible, adjust the position of the strings to ensure that they're the distance between the edge of the strings and the edge of the fretboard is equal all the way along the length of the fretboard. However, it's not that precise. The other way is there are two pneumatic bridges that you can purchase which have basically they're blank saddles. They don't have any notches in them, and you can notch them yourself, and you can position those notches very precisely to account for the distance that you want between the edge of the string and the edge of the fretboard. But since most bridges aren't made that way, we're going to calculate the distance between each string at the saddle. And the way to do that is I'm going to take my string spread at the saddle, which is 2.0625 inches. And I have to apologize here. I'm bouncing back and forth between inches and millimeters, but unfortunately, I don't really have much of a choice. Some of the information is in millimeters, some of the information is in inches, so that's just what we have to deal with. Fortunately, with calculators and computers, it's not that difficult to do. It's just a bit of a pain. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that number by 5. Even though it's 6 strings, we use 5, and that gives us the distance between the strings at the centers. And that's going to be 0.4125 inches. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type 0.4125 inches for my keyboard increment, and then I'm just going to dupe this down for each string. So we have our low E string here, then we have our A string, D string, G, B, and then this last edge is the high E string. Now what I can do is I can connect these. So I'll draw a line from here to here. Then I'll draw a line from here back to there. Then from here to here, here to here. And then our last one is our E string. So now I have the edges of my fretboard, there and there, and then I have each of the strings, the E, A, D, G, B, and E string. So I have my, basically, the edges of the fretboard and the strings laid out. And the reason why this is important is in many situations you want to know where those strings are going to fall so that you can plan out your marker dots or your inlay. So that's basically how I get the initial layout that I will use for my neck. And then I can go in and decide where I'm going to make the heel for the neck. And I can decide the shape of my headstock. And another nice feature of knowing all this information is I can extend out my lines. So let's say I want to do a straight pull tuner arrangement so that the strings are coming straight off the nut and going right to the tuner. I can draw my lines for those strings and then use that to plan the position of my tuners so that I can maintain that straight string pull. So that's why the nut is so important when it comes to planning out the layout for your guitar before you start cutting, carving, and sanding. And once you've made the decisions about the width of the nut, the string spread, the distance between each string, and if you use that handy calculator from Manchester Guitar Tech, you can really get an accurate picture and an accurate layout before you start making templates or building G-code files. Okay, I realized that this was all maybe a little bit mathy for some, and unfortunately that's just what it takes to correctly lay out a guitar so that you can be assured success when you start to string it up after you've done all the cutting, carving, sanding, finishing, spraying, polishing, and all that kind of stuff. And the worst thing that can happen is to get all the way through the process, and as you start to string up the guitar, discover that your strings are too close to the edge of the fretboard because you never took into consideration the width of the nut, the distance from the edge of the nut for each strings, and your overall string spread. So I hope you found this video to be useful, and hopefully it'll help you to avoid some of the mistakes that I know for a fact many of you are making, because I get questions about this all the time. How do I fix this? In many cases, you got to start over because you can't fix it. So just plan that nut first thing off the bat. It doesn't take that much work to do, and it's going to hopefully assure success later on. So in the meantime, as always, comment, question, click the like button, hit subscribe if you like videos on building guitars and some of the technical aspects that are involved in the process. And if you like what you see here on this channel, head over to eguitarplans.com, purchase a plan for either a guitar or the tools that are used to build guitars. And just know that when you purchase a plan for the guitar, I've kind of done all this calculation stuff. So you don't have to worry about doing that if you don't really want to. I can't say that for a lot of the plans that are out there on the internet, because I've downloaded some and found that they were way off. That's sort of a buyer beware situation, but in most cases you won't know they're off until you've made the guitar and start to string it up. And then you're presented with the horrifying reality of a guitar that's not going to work. At any rate, even if you don't buy a plan, just know that your purchase is going to help support the channel and keep me going. And if you would like to support the channel but don't want a plan, I've got some t-shirts down below. You can show your love for Highline guitars, buy a t-shirt, and help support the channel. If you can't see the merch shelf, there's a link in the description below, so be sure to check it out. And in the meantime, as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.